What separates the person who wins from the person who almost wins? It is not talent. It is rarely strength. It is almost never luck, though people desperately want to believe otherwise. The person who consistently outsmarts, outmaneuvers, and outlasts everyone around them has cultivated something far more difficult to acquire, a particular way of seeing the world. A philosophy of mind that operates differently from the crowd. A set of principles that, once internalized, shift every encounter, every challenge, and every decision in their favor. Miyamoto Musashi codified this way of thinking over 400 years ago, hammered out of a lifetime spent in mortal combat. 61 duels. 61 victories. 0 defeats. By the time he sat down to write the Book of 5 Rings in a mountain cave at the age of 60, he had already outlived every serious opponent who ever faced him, most of them within seconds of the encounter beginning. What he left behind was not a manual for sword fighting. It was a blueprint for thinking, deciding, and acting in ways that consistently produce victory regardless of the domain. The principles below are drawn from Musashi's teachings and philosophy, stripped of their feudal trappings and applied to the modern world. Whether you are competing in business, navigating relationships, advancing a career, or simply trying to get more out of life, these ideas will change how you think. 1. See what others refuse to look at. Most people lose before the contest even begins because they cannot accurately perceive reality. They see what they want to see. They assess their opponents through the lens of their own insecurities and projections. They misread situations because they are too emotionally invested in a particular outcome. Musashi called this clouded vision, and he considered it the primary source of defeat. His remedy was brutal in its simplicity. Train yourself to see things exactly as they are, not as you wish they were or fear they might be. This requires a kind of emotional detachment that most people find deeply uncomfortable. It means looking at your own weaknesses without flinching. It means honestly assessing an opponent's strengths rather than dismissing them. It means reading a situation for what it actually contains rather than what your narrative about it demands. In practice, this looks like asking ruthlessly honest questions before any major decision. What is actually happening here, as opposed to what I believe is happening? What am I afraid to acknowledge? What would a completely neutral outside observer notice that I am glossing over? These questions feel uncomfortable precisely because they work. They puncture the comforting illusions most people surround themselves with, and they force a reckoning with reality that the majority of your competitors will never bother to conduct. The person who sees clearly has an almost supernatural advantage over the person who sees selectively. They catch things earlier. They adapt faster. They make decisions based on actual conditions rather than imagined ones, and they are almost never surprised by outcomes that were clearly visible to anyone willing to look. 2. Master one thing until it becomes everything. There is a paradox at the heart of mastery that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. The deepest understanding of one thing eventually gives you access to everything. Musashi spent decades obsessing over the sword. He did not dabble. He did not diversify his practice to stay interesting. He went so far into a single pursuit that he emerged on the other side of it with a universal understanding of how excellence works, in any domain. This is why his writings speak as fluently to generals, painters, merchants, and philosophers as they do to warriors. Deep mastery of anything, genuinely deep, not merely competent, reveals the underlying patterns that govern all skill, all strategy, and all competition. Once you have felt what it is like to achieve true excellence in one area, you carry a template in your mind that you can apply everywhere else. The modern obsession with versatility, breadth, and keeping options open runs directly counter to this. People scatter their attention across a dozen interests and achieve mediocrity in all of them. They mistake variety for growth. They confuse busyness with progress. And then they wonder why someone who appears to do only one thing keeps outperforming them across every context. The answer is that depth creates transferable wisdom. Find the thing you are willing to pursue with genuine obsession, and go far enough into it that you begin to understand not just the craft itself, but the meta-principles underneath it. That is where the real education happens. And it is an education that almost no one else will ever receive, because they gave up long before reaching that depth. 3. Rhythm is everything. Learn to disrupt it. Musashi was fanatical about rhythm. He observed that every person, every organization, every system moves to a rhythm, a predictable pulse of action, reaction, and repetition. Most people are entirely unconscious of their own rhythms. They follow habitual patterns of behavior, speech, and decision-making that are entirely legible to anyone paying close enough attention. The strategist's task is twofold. First, identify your opponent's rhythm. Watch how they respond to pressure. Notice when they speed up, when they hesitate, when they default to aggression, and when they retreat into caution. Every person has tells, habitual responses embedded so deep they are invisible to the person themselves but obvious from the outside. Once you can see the rhythm, you can predict the next move with startling accuracy. Second, and more importantly, learn to break your own rhythm deliberately. Musashi was notorious for arriving at duels absurdly late, sometimes hours after the agreed time. His opponents would be psychologically primed, muscles tense, mind sharpened and waiting. By the time Musashi arrived, unhurried and seemingly indifferent, they had already spent that nervous energy on nothing. Their rhythm was broken before the fight began. He had already won. In modern life, this translates to resisting the predictable response. When everyone expects urgency, try deliberate patience. When everyone is being cautious, consider bold action. When the crowd is rushing toward something, ask what they might be running away from. The person who moves to their own rhythm, chosen intentionally rather than driven by conditioning, is always harder to anticipate, harder to counter, and harder to defeat. 4. The indirect path is usually the fastest one. There is a deep human instinct to confront problems directly, to charge at the obstacle, to address the conflict head-on, to state your ambition loudly and pursue it in a straight line. Musashi understood that this instinct, while emotionally satisfying, is tactically naive. The direct path is the path your opponent has prepared for. It is the route they have reinforced, the attack they have trained to defend, the argument they have a ready-built response to. The indirect path, approaching from an angle, solving the upstream problem, winning on terrain of your choosing rather than theirs, consistently produces better outcomes with far less cost. This is not dishonesty or manipulation. It is strategic intelligence. It is the recognition that force is expensive, while positioning is cheap. That wearing someone down directly requires enormous effort, while rendering their position untenable from an unexpected direction often requires only clear thinking. Consider how this applies to disagreement. The person who argues against a position directly becomes the enemy. The same person who asks genuine questions, who finds the valid part of the opposing argument and builds on it, who reframes the conversation entirely, that person achieves their goal without creating resistance. They went around the wall instead of through it, and they arrived at the same destination in a fraction of the time. The next time you face a significant obstacle, resist the reflex to charge it. Sit with the question, what would it mean to approach this from a completely different angle? What is the upstream cause of this problem? Who already has what I need, and what do they need from me? Where is the path of least resistance to the outcome I actually want? The answers are almost always more elegant than the direct route, and they leave you with far more energy for what comes next. 5. Be immovable in chaos. Musashi wrote extensively about what he called the immovable mind, a state of psychological stability so deep that external chaos produces no disturbance within. This was not about being cold, unfeeling, or detached from outcomes. It was about achieving a quality of presence that allowed clear perception and decisive action even when everything around you was uncertain, dangerous, and fast-moving. Most people are psychologically reactive. Their internal state is essentially dictated by their external circumstances. When things go well, they feel confident. When things go badly, they panic. When uncertainty appears, they freeze or thrash. This reactivity is, in competitive terms, a catastrophic vulnerability. It means your opponent can destabilize you simply by creating chaos. It means bad news impairs your judgment at precisely the moment when you most need it to be sharp. The immovable mind is cultivated through practice. Deliberately placing yourself in uncomfortable situations, physical, social, intellectual, and training your nervous system to remain calm within them. Meditation is one route. Genuinely difficult physical training is another. Choosing the harder path even when the easier one is available, again and again, until discomfort loses its power to cloud your thinking. The person who remains calm when everyone else is panicking has an almost absurd advantage. They see clearly when others see in distortions. They decide well when others decide poorly. They project a quality of steadiness that others find stabilizing in moments of crisis, which generates trust, authority, and followership, all the things people assume come from intelligence or charisma when they actually come from psychological depth. 6. Know when to strike, and strike without hesitation. Musashi was contemptuous of hesitation, not because boldness was inherently virtuous, but because he understood something precise about timing. The window in which an action is optimal is always narrow, and it closes fast. The person who waits for certainty before acting will find that certainty arrives at exactly the moment the opportunity has passed. This is one of the most consistently costly errors intelligent people make. They analyze thoroughly, which is correct, and then continue analyzing past the point of useful information, which is ruinous. Each additional round of analysis produces diminishing returns in insight while the window for action quietly narrows. By the time they feel ready, the moment has passed to someone less thoughtful but more decisive. Musashi's model was not impulsiveness. It was preparation followed by instant readiness. He prepared obsessively so that when the moment came, there was nothing left to decide. The analysis was complete before the encounter began. The variables were already mapped. The decision tree was already built. When the right moment appeared, all he had to do was act, and he acted without the internal dialogue that costs most people the split second that defines outcomes. The modern equivalent is doing the thinking before you are in the situation. Developing your decision-making criteria in advance so that when pressure arrives, you are executing a plan rather than formulating one. Knowing your principles so deeply that they don't need to be consulted in the moment, they simply express themselves through your actions. 7. Detach from the outcome, attach to the process. This principle is perhaps the most counterintuitive in Musashi's entire philosophy and also the most powerful. He taught that attachment to winning was one of the surest paths to defeat. Not because outcomes don't matter, they clearly do, but because obsessive focus on the outcome actually degrades the quality of the performance that produces it. When you need to win, something tightens. Your perception narrows. You become less capable of the creative, adaptive thinking that winning actually requires. You start playing not to lose rather than playing to win, defending your position rather than seizing opportunities. You become readable, predictable, and emotionally fragile. Your opponent, if they are perceptive, can feel your desperation like a change in air pressure, and they will use it against you. The alternative, complete absorption in the quality of what you are doing, moment by moment, with the outcome held lightly, produces a paradoxical freedom. When you are not protecting your ego investment in a particular result, you can see clearly, adapt quickly, and take risks that the outcome-attached person cannot afford to take. You play with a looseness and creativity that is not available to someone in the grip of need. This is not apathy. It is a very different thing from not caring. Musashi cared deeply about the quality of his preparation, the precision of his perception, the integrity of his execution. He simply refused to let the need for a specific result corrupt the process that produced results. He trusted the process completely, and the outcomes followed with a consistency that looked, to observers, like something almost magical. 8. Study constantly, especially what defeats you. Musashi spent his entire life studying. Not just his craft, but everything: painting, sculpture, philosophy, the behavior of nature, the movement patterns of animals, the architecture of military campaigns conducted centuries before his birth. He believed that wisdom had no boundaries, and that insights drawn from one domain would reveal hidden patterns in every other. But more unusually, he studied his defeats with the same intensity that most people reserve only for their victories. Every loss, every miscalculation, every moment where the outcome surprised him became material for refinement. He did not experience failure as shame to be minimized and quickly forgotten. He experienced it as information, expensive information that had been purchased at real cost, and that he was absolutely determined to extract full value from. This is the study habit that most people avoid. It is emotionally much easier to learn from success. Success confirms your existing beliefs and feels good in the review. Studying defeat requires honesty about what you got wrong, which requires a level of ego resilience that most people have never developed. They would rather attribute losses to bad luck, external factors, or the opponent's unfair advantages than sit with the uncomfortable truth that they made mistakes that could have been avoided. The person who studies their defeats honestly compounds knowledge at a rate that is simply unavailable to the person who only studies success. Every loss becomes an upgrade to the mental model. Every failure sharpens the perception. Every mistake, properly interrogated, closes a gap that would otherwise remain open indefinitely, waiting to produce the same loss in a higher-stakes situation down the road. The way is in training. Musashi closed the Book of 5 Rings with a deceptively simple instruction: you must train continuously. Not occasionally. Not when it is convenient or comfortable. Continuously. The philosophy outlined in these pages is not a set of insights to be understood intellectually and then filed away. It is a set of practices to be internalized through repetition until they become the default operating mode of your mind. Seeing clearly requires constant practice of honest perception. Mastery requires daily engagement with the craft. Maintaining rhythm and disrupting the rhythms of others requires the kind of alertness that only comes from habitual cultivation. The immovable mind does not appear on the day you need it. It is built in the thousands of ordinary moments when you could have reacted impulsively and chose instead to stay still. The people who seem to outsmart everyone around them are not operating on superior raw intelligence. They are operating from a depth of preparation and self-cultivation that most people will never pursue, not because they lack the capacity, but because they underestimate the consistency that genuine mastery demands. They want the outcome without the way. They want the victory without the practice. They want the immovable mind without ever having trained it to hold still. Musashi offers a different bargain: give yourself fully to the process, without reservation and without shortcuts, and the outcomes will take care of themselves. It is a harder path than any shortcut. It is also, by a very wide margin, the most reliable one.